There is a sound that once belonged to almost every village in medieval Europe, a deep, rhythmic turning, half-groan and half-hum carried on the wind across fields and footpaths, heard through the walls of cottages, woven into the background of daily life the way birdsong or rainfall might be. It was the sound of the mill at work, and if you followed that sound, walked along the muddy track that led away from the village green and toward the water's edge or the rise of a low hill, you would find it. The mill, and beside it, living in its shadow, flour dust settled into the creases of his hands and the lines of his face, the miller. He was one of the most recognizable figures in the medieval world. Not powerful in the way that lords and knights were powerful, not holy in the way that priests and monks carried themselves, but present, necessary, always there. In a village of perhaps a few hundred souls, everyone knew the miller, everyone needed the miller, and, if we are being honest about the historical record, a great many people did not entirely trust the miller. He occupied a curious position in the social order, indispensable and yet perpetually under a cloud of mild suspicion, a man who handled other people's grain and returned it as flour, and who had plenty of opportunity, so the thinking went, to keep a little more than his rightful share. We will come to all of that. But before the reputation, before the grudges and the rumours and the careful watching of weights and measures, there is simply the life itself, and that life is worth understanding on its own terms. To live beside a working mill in the medieval period was to live inside a particular kind of rhythm. The watermill, driven by a stream or river diverted to turn its great wooden wheel, did not keep the hours that people kept. It turned when the water ran, which in a good season meant nearly continuously through the waking day. The sounds it made were layered and constant, the low creak of the wheel itself massive and slow, water rushing and falling from its paddles in a curtain of white noise. Inside, the millstones, heavy rounds of dressed gritstone or imported lava rock, grinding against each other in a motion that you felt as much as heard, a vibration that passed through the floorboards and up through the soles of your feet. And underneath it all, the smell, grain dust and stone dust, and the faint warm sweetness of crushed wheat, a smell that got into everything, into clothing and hair and the very timber of the walls. This is a story about ordinary life, not about famous battles or the decisions of kings, not about the great turning points that appear in history books. It is something quieter and, in its own way, just as remarkable. It is about what it felt like to rise before dawn in a small stone building beside a river, to eat a particular kind of breakfast, to do a particular kind of work with your hands and your back and your careful accumulated knowledge, and then to do it all again the next day. The medieval miller lived a life shaped almost entirely by routine, by season, and by the needs of the community around him. And within that routine there was a whole world. Bread was not simply food in the medieval period, it was survival itself. The vast majority of people across England, France, the German lands, and much of Europe beyond relied on grain, wheat, rye, barley, oats, as the foundation of everything they ate. Bread made the meal. Pottage thickened with grain fed the family through winter. Ale brewed from malted grain was safer to drink than most water and provided real nourishment. Grain stored in a dry granary was wealth in its most practical form, and none of it, not the bread, not the pottage, not the ale, could be made without first turning that grain into something workable, without grinding, without the mill. This meant that the miller stood at a genuinely central point in village life. The mill was not just a workplace, it was a kind of crossroads. Farmers came to it from outlying fields and farms, sometimes waiting hours for their turn at the stones, and while they waited they talked. News travelled through the mill. Grievances aired themselves there. Arrangements were made, quiet deals struck, gossip exchanged in the slow time between the pouring of grain and the collecting of flour. The miller heard all of it. He knew more about the inner workings of his community than almost anyone, simply by virtue of being the person everyone eventually had to come to. So settle in. Let the sound of turning water and slow stone fill the background of your mind, and allow yourself to travel back to a time and a place that is both profoundly different from our own, and, in the texture of its daily worries and small satisfactions, surprisingly familiar. The wheel is turning, the grain is waiting. The morning has not yet fully arrived, and somewhere inside that mill the day is about to begin. To understand what the miller's life actually meant, to the village, to the lord who owned the land, to the peasant family scraping through a hard winter, you have to begin with bread. Not bread as we think of it now, something we buy already sliced and wrapped, something peripheral to a meal that contains a dozen other things. Bread then was the meal. For the great majority of people living in medieval Europe, grain and its products made up something close to 3/4 of everything they consumed. A peasant family in 13th century England might eat 2 pounds of bread each day per adult, alongside a thin pottage made from whatever vegetables survived the season, perhaps a little salted meat if they were fortunate, and ale, always ale, brewed from malted barley, and consumed in quantities that would seem extraordinary now, not out of indulgence but out of necessity, because it was far safer than drinking water drawn from a stream shared with animals and runoff from the fields. The grain itself came in several forms depending on where you lived and what the soil could support. Wheat was prized above all, producing a pale, relatively fine flour that made the better bread, the bread that appeared on wealthier tables. But wheat needed good soil and a reasonably kind climate, and much of northern Europe could not reliably provide both. So rye came in its place across large parts of Germany, Scandinavia, and northern France. Darker, denser, with a slight sourness that the people who grew up eating it would have found entirely normal and even comforting. Barley and oats filled in the remaining gaps, going into porridge and pottage and flatbreads and ale. The specific grain changed with the place and the season and the harvest, but the dependence on grain was universal. It was the foundation beneath everything, and everyone knew it. This is what made milling not just useful but essential in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the modern distance. Grain in its raw form, the harvested kernel, the threshed and winnowed seed, cannot simply be eaten. It must be processed. The hull must be removed, the kernel cracked, and ground down to a flour or meal fine enough to cook with. In the very earliest periods of human settlement, and still in remote or desperately poor corners of the medieval world, this was done by hand. A quern, 2 flat circular stones, one sitting on top of the other, rotated by hand, could grind grain into flour, slowly, laboriously, one small batch at a time. A woman grinding by hand with a quern stone might spend several hours each day simply keeping her family supplied with enough flour to bake their daily bread. It was relentless, exhausting work, hard on the back and the shoulders, hard on the hands, and never quite finished. The moment one day's flour was made, the next day's need was already waiting. The watermill changed this in a way that was, for its time, genuinely revolutionary. A mill driven by a flowing stream or river could grind in a single hour what might take a woman the better part of a day to produce by hand. The power of moving water, channeled through a leat or mill pond and directed against the paddles of a wooden wheel, turned the great upper millstone continuously and with a force that no human arm could match. The efficiency was so dramatic that once mills appeared in a region, hand grinding did not so much decline as it was actively suppressed. Lords who owned mills had every incentive to require that their tenants use those mills and pay for the privilege, and so in many parts of medieval Europe, the peasant family's quern stone was not merely unnecessary, it was, in certain legal arrangements, forbidden. The lord wanted his tenants grinding at his mill, paying his miller, and contributing to his income. The domestic quern became a symbol of self-sufficiency that the manorial system had decided it could not afford to permit. This brings us to the way the mill fit into the larger economy of the village and the manor. The mill was almost never simply a private business. It was a piece of manorial infrastructure, as much a part of the lord's holdings as his fields or his fish pond or his dovecote. In the feudal arrangements that shaped so much of medieval European life, the mill was what might be called a banality, a facility that the lord provided and that tenants were obliged to use, paying a toll in return. That toll was most often taken directly from the grain being ground. A set portion of each customer's flour, perhaps a 16th part, perhaps a 20th, the exact ratio varying by region and period and negotiation, was kept by the miller as his payment, or passed on to the lord as part of the mill's revenues, or divided between them in whatever proportion their arrangement specified. The mill was, in other words, a mechanism for extracting a small but steady income from every person in the community who needed to eat. And since everyone needed to eat, that meant everyone. The technology of milling came in two main forms, and which one you encountered depended largely on where you lived. The watermill was older, more widespread, and more powerful. It required a reliable source of moving water, a river or stream with sufficient flow and enough fall to turn a wheel, and so it was essentially tied to geography. You built your watermill where the water was, and the village in many cases grew up around it. Domesday Book, that extraordinary survey commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, recorded more than 6,000 mills in England alone, and the vast majority of these were watermills, clustered along rivers and streams, marking the landscape as surely as any church or castle. The windmill came later to Western Europe, appearing in the late 12th century, likely developed from designs encountered during the Crusades, or carried along trade routes from the east. It solved a problem that the watermill could not, which was the problem of flat, dry land. The fenlands of eastern England, the wide plains of northern France and the Low Countries, where water moved slowly or not at all, but where the wind came reliably off the sea. A windmill could stand almost anywhere, its great sails turning in the prevailing breeze, grinding grain just as effectively as its water-driven cousin, and opening up the possibility of milling in places where it had previously been impractical. By the 13th and 14th centuries, windmills had become a familiar part of the English and European horizon, their silhouettes recognisable for miles, their position on a hilltop or slight rise chosen deliberately to catch the most consistent wind. Whatever the type, the mill shaped the daily and weekly patterns of everyone around it. You did not simply appear at the mill whenever you felt like it. There was a schedule, sometimes formal and sometimes understood by long habit, governing whose grain was ground when. The lord's grain came first. That was rarely negotiable. After that, priority might be determined by custom, by proximity, by the miller's own judgment, or by the simple order of arrival. A farmer who brought his grain on a busy market day might wait hours for his turn while the stones worked through the loads ahead of him. This waiting time became its own kind of social institution, a gathering point where people who might otherwise pass each other silently in a field had reason to stand together and talk. The mill also created a kind of dependency that touched every corner of ordinary life. If the mill was broken, a cracked millstone, a damaged wheel, a mill pond silted up after heavy rain, the entire village felt it within days. Bread did not get made, ale did not get brewed. The rhythm of daily sustenance stuttered and slowed. The miller, in those moments of disruption, was not just missed. He was desperately needed. And when the wheel began to turn again, when the sound of grinding rose once more from the mill house, and the first sacks of fresh flour came out the door, there would have been something very close to relief moving through the community, quiet and practical and entirely genuine. It is easy, at this distance, to take for granted how completely the mill was woven into the fabric of medieval life. But try to imagine it from the inside. Try to imagine that your morning bread, your daily ale, your family's survival through the winter, all depended on a building beside a stream and the man who kept it running. That is the world the medieval miller inhabited, and that is the weight, practical, social, economic, that he carried along with the grain. So how did a man come to stand behind those turning stones in the first place? The answer was rarely simple, and it was almost never a matter of choice in the way we might understand it today. Becoming a miller in the medieval world was less a career decision than a kind of inheritance, of position, of obligation, of a particular relationship to a particular piece of machinery that might have been in a family for generations. The most common path into the trade was exactly that, inheritance. A father who held the millership passed it to a son, and that son, having grown up inside the mill house, having spent his childhood running grain to the hopper and watching the stones work and handing tools to a man who smelled perpetually of flour dust and river damp, arrived at adulthood already knowing most of what he needed to know. The knowledge transferred the way most medieval knowledge did, not through books or formal instruction, but through proximity and repetition and the slow accumulation of observed detail. By the time the son stepped into the role himself, the feel of the grain between his fingers and the sound of the stones working smoothly versus the sound that preceded a problem were already part of him, absorbed over years of quiet attention in a low-ceilinged room full of noise and movement. But inheritance was not the only door. Some millers came to the position through tenancy arrangements with the lord who owned the mill. In these cases, a man, perhaps a skilled craftsman who had demonstrated some mechanical aptitude, perhaps a more prosperous villager with the means to pay an entry fee, might negotiate a lease that gave him the right to operate the mill for a fixed term in exchange for a set payment or a share of the revenues. This was business, conducted in the language of medieval obligation and local custom, and it required a certain standing in the community and a certain confidence in one's own ability to make the mill pay. The lord wanted someone competent. A broken mill earned nothing, and an incompetent miller who drove customers away through dishonesty or poor workmanship was worse than no miller at all. Others came into the trade through service, working first as a mill hand or assistant under an established miller, learning the work at close range before eventually taking on a mill of their own. This path could take years, and it required patience, but it produced millers who knew exactly what they were doing before they were left alone to do it. In a trade where mistakes had immediate and visible consequences for the people depending on you, this slow apprenticeship had a practical logic that needed no defending. What all of these paths shared was the understanding that milling demanded far more than physical strength. This is worth pausing on, because the image of heavy lifting and brute labour can obscure how genuinely skilled the work actually was. Yes, sacks of grain were heavy. Yes, the millstones themselves, great circular slabs of granite or millstone grit, sometimes 4 feet or more across, were massive objects that required respect and careful handling. But the core competency of a good miller had almost nothing to do with how much weight he could shift. It had to do with knowledge, judgment, and a finely developed sensitivity to how the mill was behaving at any given moment. Grain itself was the first subject of study. A skilled miller needed to understand the difference between wet grain and dry grain, old grain and fresh grain, grain that had been stored well and grain that had begun to turn. Wet or damp grain did not grind cleanly. It clogged the stones and produced a flour that would not keep and was prone to mould. Grain that had begun to spoil could ruin an entire grinding and produce meal that tasted off, smelled wrong, and potentially made people ill. The miller who ran his hand through a customer's sack and could tell immediately whether it was in good condition to grind was providing a service that went well beyond simply operating machinery. He was a judge of quality, a gatekeeper of the food supply. The machinery itself required constant attention and an understanding of how all its parts worked together. The millstones needed to be dressed regularly, a process of recutting the grooves and furrows on their grinding surfaces with a mill bill, a specialized chisel-like tool, because smooth stones ground poorly, generating heat rather than cutting cleanly, scorching the flour and wearing the surfaces unevenly. Dressing stones was skilled work, uncomfortable work, done lying or crouching beside the massive stones in close proximity to sharp edges and heavy weights. Get it wrong, and the stones worked against each other in ways that damaged them. Get it right, and the mill ran quietly and efficiently, and the flour came out fine and even and cool to the touch. Beyond the stones, the miller needed to understand the wooden gearing that transferred the motion of the wheel to the mill shaft, the condition of the wheel itself, the state of the mill pond or leat, the way water flow changed with the seasons and the weather, and how to adjust all of these variables to keep the grinding consistent. In a windmill, the calculus was different but equally demanding. Reading the wind, setting the angle of the sails, knowing when to run the mill hard and when a changing gust made it necessary to pull back. These were not skills you could acquire in an afternoon. They required months of observation and years of practice before they became reliable. Then there was the matter of record keeping. Not all millers were literate in the formal sense, but a miller who could not track the grain coming in, and the toll being taken out was a miller heading for trouble, either accused of taking too much or genuinely taking too little and losing income he was owed. Some millers kept mental tallies of great sophistication, using notched tally sticks or other physical counting methods to track what passed through the mill. Others, particularly by the later medieval period and in more prosperous or institutionalized mill arrangements, kept written accounts. A miller working a large manorial mill under close scrutiny from a lord steward might be required to render written accounts of his receipts and tolls, and a man who could produce and explain those figures had a clear advantage over one who could not. The lord's influence on all of this was considerable and difficult to escape. The miller did not simply set up his operation and run it as he saw fit. He operated within a framework of custom and obligation that determined his toll rates, specified whose grain he was bound to grind first, and could include requirements about the condition of the mill, the miller being held responsible, under threat of financial penalty, for keeping the structure in good repair. Some lords appointed their millers directly, treating the position almost as a kind of office within the manorial administration. Others were more hands-off, content as long as the revenues kept coming and the tenants kept grinding. But in either case, the miller understood that he held his position at a lord's sufferance, and within bounds that had been laid down long before he arrived and would persist long after he was gone. All of which meant that the person who became a miller was not merely a tradesman. He was a particular kind of figure, technically skilled, locally embedded, shaped by the specific geography and social arrangements of his place, and responsible in ways both formal and informal for a process that touched every family within walking distance of his wheel. And so it is worth stepping inside that wheel, through the low doorway, and into the space where all of that skill and knowledge was actually put to use. Because the mill itself, the building, the machinery, the air inside, the ground beneath your feet, was unlike any other place in the medieval village. It had its own atmosphere, its own logic, its own particular kind of aliveness that you felt the moment you stepped across the threshold. The typical watermill sat close to its source of power, positioned beside a river or stream in a way that had usually been chosen with great care by whoever established it, sometimes generations before the current miller was born. A mill pond was often part of the arrangement, a weed and deepened area of water held back by a low earthen dam or weir, collecting and storing the flow so that the miller had a reliable head of water to draw on even when the stream itself ran low. From the pond, a channel called the mill race or leat carried water in a controlled flow toward the wheel, and a wooden sluice gate allowed the miller to start or stop that flow as needed, effectively switching the mill on and off. Beside all of this, there were usually smaller structures, a granary or storage barn for waiting grain, perhaps a stable, a yard where carts could be brought in and sacks unloaded. The whole complex had a functional, lived-in quality, settled into its landscape as though it had grown there rather than been built. The wheel itself was the first and most imposing thing you noticed from outside. A large overshot wheel, where water was delivered to the top and fell over the paddles or buckets, using the weight of the falling water as well as its flow, might stand 12 feet high or more, its wooden structure perpetually damp and darkened with age and moss, turning with a slow and somehow stately authority that seemed almost at odds with the tremendous noise it produced. An undershot wheel, where the current simply pushed against paddles at the bottom, was more modest but required a faster-moving stream to do its work. The sound of either, in full operation, was a deep rhythmic churning that you heard from a considerable distance before you reached the mill, a sound so much a part of the landscape that the people who lived near it likely stopped hearing it altogether, the way you stop hearing a clock in a room you've always known. Inside, the building divided itself into functional layers. On the lower floor, or sometimes in a separate undercroft, the great wooden axle of the wheel, the mill shaft, entered the building and connected to the primary gear, a large wooden wheel itself, its rim set with wooden teeth called cogs. These cogs engaged with a smaller gear called the lantern pinion, a device that looked something like a wooden cage or drum, and this transfer of motion was where the slow, powerful rotation of the water wheel was converted into the faster spinning that the millstones above required. The gearing was almost always made of wood, oak for the main wheel, sometimes fruitwood or a denser timber for the cogs that needed to resist wear, and the whole assembly clicked and knocked and complained in a particular way that an experienced miller could interpret like a language. A change in that sound, a new knock or a deepening vibration, meant something had shifted, something needed attention, something was wearing or catching or beginning to fail. The stones themselves sat on the floor above, enclosed in a wooden frame called the vat or tun that caught the flour as it was ground and directed it into a waiting chute or box. The lower stone, called the bedstone, sat fixed and still. The upper stone, the runner, turned above it, driven by the mill shaft through a vertical iron spindle at its centre. The gap between them, the gap the miller adjusted constantly, raising or lowering the runner through a system of levers and wedges, determined the coarseness or fineness of the flour. Too close and the stones rubbed against each other, burning the grain and wearing the surfaces. Too far apart and the grain passed through too quickly, coming out coarse and unevenly ground. Finding and maintaining the right gap was one of the central ongoing tasks of the miller's day, requiring a touch so practiced it became almost unconscious. Grain entered the process through the hopper, a wide-mouthed wooden funnel suspended above the eye of the upper stone, feeding a smaller vibrating trough called the shoe that delivered grain in a steady trickle into the grinding space below. The shoe was kept in motion by a piece called the damsel, a small wooden or iron fitting on the spinning mill shaft that knocked against the shoe with each rotation. producing a persistent chattering rhythm. That sound, the chatter of the damsel against the shoe, was one of the most characteristic sounds of any working mill, a fast, light percussion beneath the heavier groan of the machinery, and millers who had spent years in the trade found it as natural and unremarkable as birdsong. First-time visitors found it slightly alarming. The air inside the mill was its own particular world. Flour dust hung in the light that came through the narrow windows, drifting in slow clouds whenever a sack was moved or the grain shifted in the hopper. It settled on every surface, on the beams overhead, on the ledges and sills, on the miller's clothing and hair and eyelashes. It had a smell that was not unpleasant exactly, a dry, faintly sweet, grainy smell with an undercurrent of dampness from the wheel and the constant proximity of the water outside. The wooden machinery added its own note, the warm smell of friction and slow abrasion, of wood that had been running wet and dry for decades. Underfoot the floor was pale and soft with flour, and your footsteps left prints the way fresh snow does. The details shifted considerably from place to place. In parts of England and northern Europe, windmills stood on rises and hilltops. Their timber bodies turned bodily to face the changing wind, their great canvas sails doing the work that water did elsewhere. The windmiller's relationship with his power source was more variable and less predictable. Wind could fail entirely, or arrive suddenly with dangerous force, and the whole character of the workday was different, more contingent, more dependent on reading the sky. In flatter, drier regions, horse mills or ox mills ground grain where neither water nor wind was reliable enough. The slow circular plodding of the animal, converted into rotation by the same basic principle of gearing and shaft. The scale was different, the pace quieter, but the stones and the flour and the dust were the same, and whatever the source of power, the upkeep never stopped. Wood rotted, cogs wore down and snapped. The millstones themselves cracked under the stresses of operation, or wore so smooth that they needed dressing before they could work properly again. The mill race silted up and had to be cleared. The wheel timbers softened with constant immersion and had to be replaced section by section. A miller who let the maintenance slide found himself facing cascading failures, one worn cog putting strain on the next, an uneven stone throwing the shaft off alignment, a silted race starving the wheel of flow. The building demanded the same kind of steady, attentive care that the machinery inside it did. It was never truly finished, never entirely in order. It was always, in some small corner or another, in the process of being maintained. Before any of that machinery could do its work, before the first grain trickled down through the hopper and the first flour gathered pale and soft in the trough below, there was a morning. And that morning began, almost always, well before the light did. Imagine waking in the dark. Not the partial dark of a room with curtains or street light bleeding through the edges of a window, but a complete and unbroken darkness, the kind that makes you feel the weight of the air. The miller's sleeping space was typically close to the mill itself, sometimes in the same building, sometimes in a cottage just steps away. And even in sleep there was the faint, persistent sound of water, the slow push and pull of the mill pond, the trickle of the race. You've been hearing it your whole life. It is less a sound than a condition, the way silence is a condition for someone who has always lived quietly. You wake into it, and then you lie still for just a moment, reading it without quite knowing you're doing so, listening for anything that has changed in the night. That listening was not idle habit. It was the first act of the working day. A miller knew the sounds his mill made the way a mother knows the sounds her household makes, the particular rhythm that meant everything was as it should be, and every small variation that meant it wasn't. Water running too fast through the sluice, or barely running at all. A new creak in the wheel struck G, the absence of a sound that should be there, These things registered even through sleep, and many millers would have woken in the night, risen without fully deciding to, gone to check something, and returned to bed satisfied before the cold fully settled in their bones. The season shaped everything about how that morning began. In the depths of winter, rising meant rising into a darkness that would not lift for hours, into cold, sharp enough to make the breath visible inside the room, into a world outside where frost sometimes stiffened the edges of the mill race and made the wheel sluggish before the flow had a chance to warm the timbers. The miller lit a tallow candle or a rushlight and moved with the economy of someone who has performed the same movements 10,000 times, dressing without ceremony, pulling on the heavy, flower-whitened smock that distinguished his trade to anyone who saw him in the village. Summer was kinder. The sky in June or July would already be lightening toward grey before the birds had quite decided to start, and the first walk out to the water had a different quality, damp and mild and full of the smell of grass and the particular freshness that comes with a very early hour in warm weather. That walk out to the water was always one of the first things. You pushed open the door and went to look at the pond to see what the night had brought. A dry spell could lower the level noticeably between one evening and the next. A heavy rain could raise it faster than comfortable, threatening to overwhelm the weir and complicate the morning's flow. In autumn, leaves gathered in the mill race and needed clearing. In spring, the snowmelt in higher ground could send the stream running high and fast, and there were mornings when the miller has to think carefully about how much water he let in, how much power was actually manageable given the condition of the machinery. Too much pressure on the wheel, the wrong kind of force at the wrong time, could stress the axle, strip a cog, set the whole chain of gears running at a pace that the stones could not safely handle. The sluice gate came next. Lifting or adjusting it was a physical task, often requiring real effort against the weight of the water pressing on the boards, and it was also a kind of decision, how much, how fast, given what you knew about the pond level and what you expected from the day ahead. If the gate stuck, which it did in cold weather when the timber swelled, you worked at it with patient force until it gave. Then you listened to the water enter the race, and you watched the wheel begin its slow first movements, and you listened again for anything in that start-up sound that needed attention before you went any further. The stones required inspection before grinding began. Running your hand across the surface of the runner, carefully, always carefully, reading the texture with your palm, told you whether the dress was still sharp enough to work cleanly, or whether the surface had begun to glaze and smooth in ways that would produce heat instead of flour. You checked the spindle, the bridge tree beneath, the gap adjustment. You looked at the hopper, still empty, and at the shoe, and at the damsel waiting motionless on the shaft. Everything dormant, everything ready, the machinery holding the particular stillness that felt almost like anticipation. Then the tools. A good miller kept his bill, the sharp iron pick used for dressing the stones, close at hand, along with the wedges and levers needed for adjusting the gap, and various smaller instruments for clearing and maintaining the works. You checked that these were where they should be. You checked the grain stores, moving through the storage space with the candle or the early light coming through the door, estimating what was on hand against what the day was likely to demand. In a busy week, those stores could drop surprisingly fast, and a miller caught short of ready grain had customers arriving with expectations he couldn't meet. And the customers arrived early. In a working village, the miller was not the only one awake before the sun was properly up. A farmer might come at first light with a sack on a cart, having loaded it the evening before. A good wife might walk over in the cool of the morning carrying grain in a cloth sack across her shoulders, hoping to have her flour ground and be home before the household needed her. The first arrivals were usually the ones with the most urgency. A household that had run low, a baker needing flour for the day's bread, someone whose grain had been sitting in the queue, and who had been waiting with diminishing patience. They came with their expectations already formed. How fine the flour should be, how long it should take, how much should come back to them after the miller took his toll. That last part, the question of the toll, was never entirely simple, and it cast a particular social light over those early morning exchanges. But for now, in these first quiet minutes, it was still just the approach, a figure emerging from the lane, a sack over one shoulder, breath rising in the cool air, crossing the yard toward the open mill door where the sound of the water and the slow first turning of the wheel had already begun to fill the morning. The day had started. It had started the way it always did, with maintenance and listening and small careful decisions made in the half-light, before anyone arrived to witness them. And now it was about to become something more public, more complicated and considerably louder. The first sack arriving over a farmer's shoulder was not simply grain. It was a small act of trust, and the miller understood it as such. A man or woman who had grown that grain, harvested it, dried it, stored it through difficult weather, and carried it down the lane was handing over something they had worked months to produce. What came back to them mattered. How it came back to them mattered. And so the process that began with that arrival was not merely mechanical. It was a transaction with weight on both sides. The first thing the miller did was receive and measure. Most mills kept a set of measures. Wooden vessels of standard size, sometimes banded with iron, worn smooth from years of use. And the incoming grain was assessed and recorded, at least in the miller's memory, and often in a simple tally. A busy mill might see grain arrive from a dozen different households in a single morning, and keeping clear account of whose was whose required an organised mind and a consistent system. The sacks were marked or identifiable by their cloth, their size, their familiar smell, and the miller committed to memory which household's grain was which, queuing them in the order they had arrived, or by some arrangement of priority that the community understood. The grain itself varied considerably depending on the season, the region, and the household circumstances. Wheat was the most prized. It ground into a fine, pale flour that made the best bread. Soft, light, something close to white when the bran was sifted away. And it was the grain of relative prosperity. Rye came next in common use, harder and darker, producing a denser flour with a slightly sharp, earthy quality. In many parts of medieval England, rye bread was simply what most people ate most of the time, and a good rye grind was nothing to look down on. Barley came through the mill regularly as well, though much of it was destined not for bread but for ale, malted, cracked, prepared in ways that required a slightly different approach to the stones. And oats, especially in the north and in Wales, were a staple that the mill handled frequently, producing the coarse, gritty meal that became porridge and oatcakes and a dozen other things that fed working people through long winters. Each grain behaved differently. Wheat was cooperative, flowing evenly through the hopper, grinding clean and predictably. Rye was slightly stickier, more prone to clogging the shoe if the flour grew damp. Barley could be dusty in ways that got into everything. Oats were light and required care to keep from flying off into the working parts of the mechanism. A miller who had spent years at the work knew how to adjust his feed and his pace for each type, making small corrections without thinking about them, the way a skilled cook adjusts heat without measuring. The stone setting was everything when it came to the finished flour. Lowering the runner stone, bringing it close to the bedstone beneath, produced a finer grind, a softer flour better suited to bread. Raising it slightly gave a coarser meal, better for certain porridges or animal feed, or for the first pass-on grain that would go through again. The gap between the stones was adjusted by moving the bridge tree, the heavy timber beneath the bedstone that bore the weight of the spindle. Even a small movement made a significant difference to the texture of what came out, and the sharpness of the dressing on the stone faces mattered just as much. Sharp, cleanly dressed furrows cut the grain efficiently and let the flour fall away through the grooves without generating excess heat. Stones that had gone too smooth ground more slowly and produced heat that could subtly change the flour's character, sometimes darkening it, sometimes imparting a faint scorched note that a careful householder would notice in her bread. The miller managed this continuously as the morning progressed. He fed grain into the hopper and watched the shoe, the angled trough that delivered grain to the eye of the stone, and listened to the sound of the grinding which told him as much as his eyes could. A clean, steady, slightly hushing rumble meant the stones were working well and the grain was feeding correctly. A higher-pitched sound or a stuttering rhythm told him something needed adjustment. He reached into the meal trough periodically and rubbed flour between his fingers, reading its fineness and warmth, deciding whether the gap needed changing or the feed needed slowing. This was the heart of the skill, not the lifting or the sack handling, though those were tiring enough, but the sustained attention, the constant reading of sound and texture and pace, the small decisions made dozens of times in a single morning. Grinding too fast built heat and risked glazing the stones. Grinding too slowly cost time and frustrated customers. Finding the steady pace that matched the water's available power to the type of grain and the desired result required experience that could not be hurried into existence. Apprentice millers made mistakes that showed up in the flour, and those mistakes were noticed, sometimes loudly, by the households that took the flour home. When a batch was finished, the flour was gathered from the trough and bagged, and here the miller took his share. This was the toll, the customary fee taken not in coin, in most cases, but in kind, as a portion of the grain or flour itself. The amount varied by region and tradition and negotiation, but a common figure hovered somewhere around 1/16 of what was brought in, sometimes more, sometimes negotiated lower, for large regular customers or higher for small occasional ones. The toll was measured with the same wooden vessels, and the miller set his portion aside before returning the rest to the customer's sack. It was a system that had been formalized over generations, recognized in law, sometimes specified in the terms by which the miller held his tenancy from the lord of the manor. In practice, the toll was also one of the primary sources of the miller's reputation and his notoriety. A generous toll measure, heaped slightly, gave the miller more. A modest one, levelled flat, gave the customer more. The difference was not always large in any single transaction, but across hundreds of sacks and dozens of families, and the whole span of a year, it accumulated significantly. The mill's customers watched this closely, and the miller knew they watched. He performed the measuring with a particular deliberateness, a visible fairness, because trust was the real foundation beneath all those sacks of grain. Lose it, and people found reasons to use a mill farther away, or to complain to the lord. Keep it, and the queue outside the mill door stayed steady through the year. By mid-morning, the mill was fully in its rhythm. The wheel turning, the stones working, the hopper refilling from the next waiting sack, the flour gathering pale and soft in the trough below. Dust hung in the air and settled on every surface, on the miller's smock and eyebrows and the back of his hands. The smell of fresh flour was everywhere, warm and slightly sweet and clean, in a way that flour fresh from the stone always is. Outside, someone waited with the next load. Inside, the work continued steady and absorbing, demanding everything the miller had learned to give it. By mid-morning, with the wheel turning steadily and the flour gathering in the trough, there was a deceptive ease to the mill's rhythm. From a distance it might have looked almost serene. Water doing most of the work, the machinery carrying the load, the miller simply attending. But the body told a different story. The physical demands of the trade were constant, quiet, and cumulative, and they left their mark on every miller who worked the stones for any length of time. The lifting alone was enough to reshape a man over years. A full sack of grain could weigh anywhere from 60 to well over 100 pounds, depending on what it held and how it had been filled, and those sacks moved many times before the flour went home with its owner. They came in from carts and shoulders, were heaved up onto platforms, tipped into hoppers, gathered again when full of flour and loaded back out. On a busy day, a miller might move many hundreds of pounds of grain without ever thinking of it as unusual. He developed a particular kind of strength in the back, the shoulders, the thick muscles around the base of the neck, that was not the trained strength of a soldier or the lean strength of a ploughman, but something dense and functional, built one sack at a time across a working lifetime. The machinery required its own kind of physical engagement. The millstones themselves were immense objects. A typical pair might each weigh more than a ton, and while the water wheel carried the burden of keeping the runner stone moving, there were times when the stones had to be stopped, lifted, and worked on by hand. Dressing the stones was one of the miller's most important and most demanding tasks. Over time and use, the carefully cut furrows on the grinding faces wore smooth. The sharp edges that cracked the grain and channeled the flour away gradually became blunt, and the stones began to generate heat rather than cut cleanly. When that happened, and a miller felt the warmth rising from the meal trough, or noticed the flour darkening slightly at the edges, or heard a subtle change in the grinding note, he knew it was time. Dressing required lifting the runner stone, which was done with levers and considerable effort, and propping it safely so that the face could be reached with a mill bill, a small hard pick shaped specifically for the work. The miller chipped carefully along the furrows, recutting their edges, restoring the pattern that allowed the grain to flow and grind and release cleanly. It was slow, precise work that required both strength and a careful hand. Done poorly, the dressing would be uneven, and the stones would grind worse than before, producing flour with a gritty quality or failing to cut through the grain efficiently. Done well, the restored stones ran cool and smooth, and the difference showed immediately in the texture of what came out. A miller who dressed his stones well was proud of it, and rightly so. It was a craftsman's skill in the fullest sense. Preventing overheating was not only a matter of aesthetics. Stones that ran too hot could scorch the flour, leaving it with a faint bitter undertone that careful bakers noticed and complained about. More dangerously, in a building full of dry wood and flour dust, heat was never something to be taken lightly. The mill was one of the more fire-prone structures in any medieval village, not because millers were careless, but because the conditions inside worked persistently against caution. Fine flour dust settled on every beam and surface, and in certain concentrations it was combustible in ways that even a small spark could demonstrate. A miller kept water close at hand, watched his stone's temperature habitually, and learned to recognize the particular warm, slightly sharp smell that meant the grinding was running too hot and needed to be slowed. The noise was a constant companion, and not a gentle one. The wheel, the gears, the turning spindle, the grinding stones, all of it together produced a sound that was felt as much as heard, a low, pervasive rumble threaded through with the higher percussion of the wooden teeth in the gear rings and the steady rush of water below. Working in that sound all day, day after day across a career, took its toll in the gradual way that sustained noise always does. Older millers often found that conversation required more effort than it once had, that they needed to position themselves carefully to follow what was being said, that the mill's voice had slowly become part of how they perceived the world, always present even in the evening quiet, still faintly ringing in the ears after the wheel had stopped. The dust was perhaps the most insidious daily burden, Flour dust was everywhere, in the air on every surface, in the creases of clothing and skin, in the nose and throat and lungs. A working miller breathed it all day. He grew accustomed to it, hardly noticed it, went home with it whitening his hair, and settled into the lines of his face. Over years and decades, that steady intake of fine particulate left traces in the chest that showed up as a persistent cough in later life, a tightness in the breath, a voice that had gone slightly rough. It was simply the occupational condition of the work, understood and accepted, the way a blacksmith understood soot and a tanner understood certain smells. Accidents happened, and they happened in the particular ways that machinery always produces. Quickly, without much warning, and usually involving the gap between a human body and something moving faster than it appeared. Clothing caught in turning shafts. Hands that reached too close to the hopper found the machinery indifferent to the distinction between grain and fingers. A floor made slick by spilled water or loose flour underfoot did not forgive an unbalanced step near heavy equipment. None of this made the mill a place of constant crisis. Most days passed without incident, but the potential was always quietly present, and experienced millers moved through their workspace with a particular care that became second nature, a physical awareness of where things moved and what clearances were safe. Weather and water made the work unpredictable in ways that planning could only partially address. A watermill ran on the stream's goodwill, and streams had their own schedules. Summer droughts dropped the water level and slowed the wheel, sometimes to a crawl that made grinding barely worthwhile. Autumn floods brought too much water too fast, overwhelming the sluice and threatening the wheel itself with the force of debris-laden current. Hard winters iced the mill pond and the race, and a frozen mill was simply stopped, waiting for a thaw that came when it chose. A windmill had its own temperament. The miller who worked, one was always watching the sky, judging the wind's direction and strength, adjusting the sails, choosing whether to engage the stones or tie everything down against a sudden gust that could take the machinery beyond safe speed. What all of this produced, over years, was a kind of practical knowledge that no apprenticeship could fully convey and no written record could contain. The miller understood his mill the way a good craftsperson always understands their tools, not theoretically, but in the hands and the ears and the instincts. He knew the sound his particular wheel made when the water was exactly right. He knew the vibration in the floor that meant the gear teeth were beginning to wear. He knew the light quality that came through the dust-hazed window in late morning, and what it meant for how much grinding remained in the day. These were not the skills of a simple labourer doing repetitive work. They were the accumulated intelligence of someone who had made a machine his life's work, who had learned its moods and its limits and its capabilities, and who kept it turning day after day in service of everyone around him. After a morning of that kind of work, the lifting, the listening, the careful attention to stone and water and wheel, hunger came honestly. And when the miller finally stepped back from the machinery and moved toward the house, what waited on the table was modest by almost any measure, but it was rarely nothing, and compared to some households in the village, it had its quiet advantages. The miller's position beside the grain supply meant that his family seldom lacked for bread. That simple fact shaped the household's eating more than anything else. Bread was not a side consideration in a medieval diet. It was the centre of nearly every meal, the thing the other foods existed alongside or on top of, and having reliable access to flour meant having reliable access to the daily loaf. The bread on a miller's table was typically made from wheat or rye, depending on what the local land produced, and it was baked in a heavy round that held its heat well and kept for several days if stored carefully away from moisture. When fresh from the oven, it had a particular quality, a dense, slightly sour interior from the levain or old dough used to start it, and a crust that crackled faintly when pressed. The smell of it filled a small house entirely, warm and yeasty, mixing with wood smoke and whatever else was simmering nearby. Porridge was the other constant. Made from oats, barley, or whatever grain was at hand, it cooked slowly over the fire in a heavy pot, thickening through the morning into something filling and warming that could carry a person through several hours of hard work. It was not delicate food. It had a particular earthiness, especially the barley versions, a slight bitterness balanced by whatever fat or salt could be stirred in. But it was reliable, it was plentiful, and in the cooler months there was something genuinely comforting about a bowl of it, eaten close to the fire before the day's demands took hold. Ale was as much a part of daily nourishment as the food itself. Brewed from malted grain and water, it was thicker and less potent than what the modern imagination might picture, closer to a nutritious liquid bread than to a strong drink. It was safer than untreated water in many circumstances, and it provided calories the body needed alongside everything else. A miller's wife might brew regularly at home, or the family might obtain ale from a local alewife in the village, often trading flour or small services for the supply. On ordinary days, adults and older children drank it throughout meals without much ceremony. It was simply part of eating, as unremarkable as the bread beside it. Dairy appeared on the table when the season and the household's means allowed. A cow or a few goats, if the family kept them, produced milk that was used fresh, turned into simple cheese, or skimmed for butter. Butter worked into bread or stirred into porridge made a significant difference to the taste and the sense of fullness afterward. Cheese kept longer than fresh milk and travelled well, which meant it showed up in meals across a wide stretch of the year, a firm, aged piece set beside bread at midday, sharp and slightly crumbly, the kind of thing that required no preparation beyond cutting. On days when the dairy ran low, these additions disappeared from the table, and the meals became plainer, but they were never the kind of household where such things were entirely unknown. Meat appeared less often than some comfortable imaginings of medieval eating might suggest, but more often than a purely poor household would have managed. Pigs were the most practical animal for the small farmstead. They ate scraps, required little pasture, and could be slaughtered in late autumn to provide salted or smoked meat through the winter months. That preserved pork was precious. A miller's family might have a joint of salted bacon hanging near the hearth, small pieces of which went into the cooking pot to flavour a broth or a bean pottage, stretching the taste of meat far further than using it outright. The smell of it rendering slowly into a pot of vegetables was one of those hearthside signals that something better than usual was coming. Chickens provided eggs more reliably than they provided meat, and those eggs, poached in simmering water or broken directly into a pan near the fire, were simple and sustaining additions to days when nothing else was available to add to the bread. Fish, too, appeared when proximity to the mill stream made catching practical, and a miller with a weir or the rights to fish his stretch of water might bring in something fresh on a fortunate afternoon. The kitchen garden contributed through the warmer months more than it sometimes receives credit for. Peas, leeks, onions, and cabbages were the reliable staples, humble on their own, but essential when cooked into pottage, that broad category of simmered meals that functioned as the daily hot dish in most ordinary households. Pottage on a good day was thick and savoury, fragrant with onion and herb, filling in a way that bread alone could not match. On a lean day it was thinner, more broth than substance, seasoned with what little was at hand. Herbs, mint, sage, thyme, whatever grew near the door, added small amounts of flavour that made a real difference to a palate otherwise limited in its range. Dried legumes kept through winter in storage and found their way into the pot when fresh vegetables were gone, providing warmth and bulk through the months when the garden offered nothing. When a feast day came or a better week arrived after a good harvest, the table changed noticeably. A whole roasted bird rather than a careful scattering of egg, a sweeter loaf made from finer white flour, soft enough that the crust yielded gently rather than requiring effort. Fresh dairy, a proper wedge of new cheese, perhaps a little honey drizzled over bread in a way that tasted almost unbelievably sweet against the ordinary plain flavours of daily life. Spices were expensive and out of reach for most days, but cinnamon or pepper appearing in festival food marked the occasion as genuinely different. Their sharp, almost foreign warmth, a reminder that the world contained flavours well beyond the usual. Ordinary days asked less of the imagination and more of the cook's patience, but there was a kind of satisfaction built into those everyday meals that came from their repeatability, their predictability, their small warmth against the background of hard work. The fire, the pot, the loaf, the ale, eaten with family after the wheel had been stopped and the mill locked up for the evening, when the day's noise was finally out of the air and the room held only the sound of the fire settling and voices speaking quietly. Food, for a miller, was not cuisine in any elevated sense. It was sustenance made with what was at hand, shaped by season and circumstance, and it tasted, at the end of a working day, like exactly what it was: enough. When the meal was finished and the table cleared, life continued in the same space where it had always been lived, close to the mill, close to the water, close to the turning of the wheel, even when the wheel was still. The home of a medieval miller was rarely far from the work itself. In many cases it was built directly beside the mill building, sometimes sharing a wall with it, sometimes standing only a few steps across a muddy yard. The proximity was practical rather than incidental. The miller needed to hear if something changed in the night, a rise in the water, a grinding that shouldn't be grinding, a gate left open to the mill race. Living at a distance from the machinery was simply not how the job worked, and so home and work existed in a kind of permanent nearness, the boundary between them porous in ways that shaped every aspect of domestic life. The house itself was modest, though not necessarily the poorest structure in the village. A miller with a steady income from tolls and a position of some local importance might inhabit something slightly better built than the average labourer's dwelling. A timber-framed structure with wattle and daub walls, a thatched roof that needed regular attention, and a packed earth floor that the household swept and sometimes strewed with dried rushes or straw to absorb the damp and the dirt tracked in from outside. The main room served as the centre of everything. Cooking happened there, eating happened there, much of the family's working life during the colder months happened there. A loft above, reached by a ladder or a narrow stair, provided sleeping space away from the smoke and the daily activity, though it was never truly separate from the life below. Heat came from the hearth, which in older homes was simply a fire set in the middle of the floor, with the smoke drifting upward toward a hole in the roof. Later medieval structures sometimes had a chimney fitted against one wall, which drew better and kept the room clearer, but even then the fire was the undisputed centre of the household in every practical sense. It cooked the food, dried the wet clothing, warmed the hands of children sitting close to it in the evening, and provided the only real light after dark aside from a rushlight or tallow candle. Keeping it fed with wood or peat was a daily task that never ended. Someone in the household was always thinking about the fuel supply, carrying it, stacking it, watching to make sure the fire stayed manageable. The fire going out overnight was a genuine inconvenience, which is why coals were carefully banked before sleeping, and the morning's first task was often coaxing them back to life. Bedding was shared and functional. A mattress stuffed with straw or dried bracken, perhaps with a woolen blanket above, laid on a simple wooden frame or low platform. This was where the household rested, and in colder seasons the warmth of bodies close together was not a matter of sentiment but of survival. Wealthier millers might have feather bedding, a genuine luxury that held warmth in a different way entirely, softer and more forgiving than straw. But for most, It was whatever the household could manage, kept clean as circumstances allowed, and replaced when the stuffing wore down too flat to be comfortable. Children often slept together in the loft, arranged in the practical way of households, where space was not abundant, and no one expected privacy in the modern sense of the word. Storage was built into every available surface and corner. Barrels held grain, dried legumes and salted provisions. Hooks above the hearth bore smoked meats or bundled herbs. Baskets on shelves held cheeses wrapped in cloth, dried apples, the small supplies that carried the household through lean stretches. The storage arrangements of a miller's home had an extra dimension compared to many neighbouring households. There was generally more grain under the roof, more flour in sacks leaning against the wall, and the particular smell of freshly milled grain that never entirely left the fabric of the building. Flour dust settled on everything, worked its way into the gaps in the floorboards, and became part of the texture of daily life in a way that was invisible to the family but apparent to anyone entering from outside. The miller's spouse was essential to the running of this household in ways that extended well beyond the purely domestic. She managed the food stores, oversaw the brewing of ale when it was done at home, maintained the kitchen garden, tended whatever animals the household kept, and often helped directly with the lighter work around the mill, receiving grain from customers, measuring out the tolls, keeping track of what had come in and what had gone out. Children were drawn into this economy as soon as they were old enough to carry something or watch something, their contributions scaling upward with their age and strength. A boy of 10 might carry sacks across the yard, help with the animals, or keep watch while his father attended to the mill machinery. A girl of similar age might be spinning wool near the fire in the evening, helping prepare meals, or watching younger siblings while her mother worked elsewhere. Apprentices or servants, where the household could support them, filled in the labour gaps, sleeping in the loft or in a small outbuilding, eating at the same table, working within the household economy in exchange for their keep. Washing was a periodic affair rather than a daily one. Water had to be carried or drawn, heated over the fire and used carefully before it cooled too far to be useful. Clothing was washed when it needed washing, which in a working household meant regularly but never constantly. The coarse linen or wool garments that a miller and his family wore were built for durability rather than delicacy. A miller's everyday tunic could take rough treatment without suffering greatly, which was fortunate given the conditions it endured. Flour dust accumulated on clothing as it accumulated everywhere else, turning work garments a pale, ghostly colour by the end of a long day. Personal washing followed a similar logic. A quick rinse of the face and hands was a daily matter, while more thorough bathing was less frequent and required considerably more effort to arrange. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a household in which the line between working and living was almost impossible to draw. The sound of the mill carried into the main room. The smell of grain lived in the walls. The customers who came to have their grain ground came to a place that was also a home, and the transactions of the working day unfolded within earshot of children, beside the family's stored provisions, in a space that served simultaneously as a workplace and a refuge. There was a texture to this kind of life that the purely commercial or purely domestic household did not share, a quality of constant involvement, where rest and work existed in the same rooms and under the same roof, where the rhythm of the wheel outside was simply part of the sound of home. By late afternoon, when the light began to thin and the air coming off the mill stream turned cooler, the house drew the family back. The fire was built up again, the evening meal was set to warm, and the sounds of the working day gave way to something quieter, more private, the household folding inward around the hearth as the wider world outside settled toward dark. Every village had its necessary people, the priest who marked the turning points of life, the blacksmith whose work held the community together in iron and fire, the alewife who kept the ale flowing through seasons of celebration and grief. The miller occupied a place in this small constellation that was essential, yet strangely uneasy, a position defined as much by suspicion as by usefulness, by old jokes as much as by genuine gratitude. You needed the miller, everyone agreed on that. But needing someone and trusting them were not always the same thing in a medieval village, and the miller understood this better than most. The suspicion had a specific shape. When you brought your grain to the mill, you handed it over to another person's care, and when you received your flour in return, you received something measured out by that other person's hand. The toll, the portion of grain or flour the miller kept as payment for his work, was regulated by law and custom, but the actual measuring happened inside the mill, away from the constant oversight of the customer. A small wooden dish called the toll dish was used to scoop the payment from the grain before grinding began, and the amount it held was supposed to be fixed and fair. In practice, the question of whether the dish was the right size, whether it was heaped a little too generously, whether a second dip had been taken when no one was watching, these were questions that ran quietly beneath every transaction, never entirely answered, never entirely set aside. Medieval literature was not gentle on this point. The miller who took more than his share was practically a stock character by the later medieval period, appearing in sermon literature, in fablio tales, in Chaucer's Reeve's Tale, as a figure of low cunning and cheerful dishonesty, a man who stole by thumb and grain and half measure and considered it part of the trade. The jokes circulated widely enough that any miller would have heard them applied to his profession, perhaps even told them himself with a kind of wry acceptance. There was a whole vocabulary of small thefts attributed to the trade. A thumb pressed into the scale, a bit taken from each customer's portion, a slightly deeper toll dish than the rules permitted. Whether individual millers deserved all of this or simply inherited a reputation built up over generations was a question the reputation itself refused to answer, and yet people kept coming. Day after day, season after season, the grain arrived and the flour went home, and the village continued to depend on the mill and the man who ran it. This tension between dependence and distrust gave the miller's social world a particular texture that was unlike that of the blacksmith or the carpenter or the reeve. Those men had reputations attached to skill and craft. The miller's reputation was attached to his honesty, which was always under a kind of gentle siege. What helped was the mill's other function, one that operated alongside the purely practical one and was in some ways just as important. The mill was a gathering place. When farmers brought their grain and settled in to wait, because the grinding took time, and the queue on a busy market day could stretch the wait considerably. They stood about in the mill yard, or just inside the doorway talking. News from the next village arrived at the mill before it reached most households. Word of a marriage, a death, a dispute over field boundaries, the price of wool at the nearest market, the health of a lord 3 manors away, all of it passed through the mill in the mouths of the people who came there with their grain and went home with their flour. The miller, standing at the centre of this flow of information, heard more than most people in the village ever did. This made him something more than a craftsman and something different from a merchant. He was a node in the community's information network, a figure who knew what was happening across a wide circle of farms and households simply because all of them eventually came to him. A miller who understood the value of this, who remembered what he heard, who could speak to one farmer about another situation in ways that smoothed over difficulties or helped broker small arrangements, had a social resource that no amount of mechanical skill could entirely replicate. Reputation, when it ran in the miller's favour, was built not just from fair measurement, but from this quality of engaged, attentive presence at the centre of village life. His standing in the social order was neither high nor entirely low, and that ambiguity was itself a defining feature of the position. He ranked above a landless labourer and generally above the poorest peasant households. He was not a lord, not a knight, not a churchman. Among the working population of a typical medieval village, he sat somewhere near the level of a skilled craftsman, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the fuller, with perhaps a slight additional weight of local importance drawn from the fact that his work was not optional. Some millers accumulated enough wealth over time to employ servants, lease additional land, or become minor players in the local economic arrangements that shaped village life. Others remained modest figures whose position rested more on function than on wealth. What separated the miller's social standing from that of other craftsmen, perhaps more than anything else, was the need to earn trust in a way that skill alone could not accomplish. A blacksmith's horseshoe either held or it didn't. A carpenter's joint either fit or it didn't. The quality of their work was visible and testable, and could speak for itself over time. The miller's honesty was harder to verify and easier to doubt, which meant that each transaction carried with it a small, quiet weight of social negotiation. A miller who was known to deal fairly, who measured honestly, who returned the correct flour, who did not let the toll-dish grow mysteriously deeper over the years, built his reputation one exchange at a time, in increments too small to be dramatic but too consistent to be ignored. Over years, this kind of steady trustworthiness became its own form of standing. Villagers who had brought their grain to the same mill for a decade or two developed a working relationship with the miller that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite the purely commercial exchange of the market, something in between, a familiar and functional bond built from repeated dealings and the shared knowledge that things had always been handled honestly. Children grew up knowing the miller's name, knowing the particular sound of the mill, coming to see the place as simply part of the fabric of the world. When that miller's son took over the work in his turn, some portion of that accumulated goodwill passed to him, a kind of inherited reputation he still had to tend carefully if he wanted to keep it. The mill yard as evening came on would empty gradually, the last customers collecting their flour and heading home along the field paths, the sounds of talk and waiting giving way to something quieter. But the conversations of the day didn't entirely disappear. They travelled outward with each person who left, carrying the news and the small negotiations and the slow ongoing work of community life into the cottages and farmsteads scattered around the mill. The miller stood at the centre of all of it, useful and a little suspect, trusted by long familiarity, and essential in a way that even the oldest jokes couldn't quite diminish. Behind every miller's daily work, behind the toll dish and the turning stones and the long queue of customers waiting with their grain, there was another layer of authority that shaped how the mill operated and who ultimately profited from it. The miller might have been the man who understood the machinery, who knew the feel of the flour between his fingers and the sound of the stones when they needed dressing. But in most cases he did not own the mill he ran. Someone else did, and that someone else was almost always a lord. Mills were valuable. A watermill or windmill represented a significant investment of timber, stone, metalwork, and skilled labour to build and maintain, and once established, it generated a reliable and predictable income from the surrounding countryside in a way that agricultural land alone did not. Lords recognised this early, and by the time the medieval period was well underway, the ownership of mills across much of England and Europe was concentrated firmly in manorial hands. A village might have one mill, or occasionally two, and the lord of the manor held it as part of his estate, drawing income from it season after season while the miller did the daily work. This arrangement worked through a system of rent. A miller who operated a lord's mill paid for the privilege of running it, typically in money or in a portion of the flour that passed through the stones, or sometimes in a combination of both. In return, He kept the remaining toll payments that came from the farmers who brought their grain. His livelihood depended on the difference between what he paid the lord and what he collected from his customers, which meant that a good year of harvests and a steady flow of grain through the mill could leave him reasonably comfortable, while a poor harvest or a stretch of mechanical trouble could narrow that margin very quickly. The lord's rent was generally owed regardless of what the season brought. In many parts of medieval Europe, the arrangement went further than simple rental. Lords exercised what are sometimes called banal rights, or soak rights, legal entitlements that required the peasants living within a defined territory to use a specific mill for their grinding, and no other. Under these customs, a farmer could not simply take his grain to a neighbouring mill if he found the local wait too long or the tolls too high. He was obligated by manorial custom and enforceable law to use the lord's mill, and his lord collected the fees that resulted. The miller who ran that mill operated in effect as the agent of a local monopoly, whether he thought of it in those terms or not. These arrangements were not universal and not uniform. They varied considerably from one place to another and from one century to the next. In some regions they were enforced with real rigour, with manor court records showing presentments against tenants who had their grain ground elsewhere. In others they existed more loosely, as customary expectations that bent under pressure from practical necessity or the slow drift of economic change. By the later medieval period, especially after the disruptions of plague and shifting labour conditions, the strictness with which these rules were applied had relaxed in many places. But for much of the earlier medieval centuries, in the villages where these obligations held, they were part of the fabric of life in the same way that other manorial customs were. Not quite chosen, not quite negotiable, simply the way things were done. The miller's relationship with manorial authority was closer than that of many other tradespeople, simply because the mill itself was so deeply embedded in the lord's estate. He appeared before the manor court not only when disputes arose, but as a routine participant in the administrative life of the community. The manor court was the institution through which lords regulated their estates, heard complaints, adjudicated small disputes, and collected fines, and the mill appeared before it with some regularity. Millers could be presented for taking excessive toll, for dipping the toll dish too freely or returning short measure, and fines were levied when customers complained and the complaint was found credible. The court records that survive from medieval English manors contain scattered entries of exactly this kind, small legal moments in which the miller's honesty was called into question in an official setting. Disputes also arose over the physical condition of the mill. If the mill pond dam broke, or the millstones cracked, or the wooden gearing wore down and grinding stopped, the question of who was responsible for the repair could become genuinely contentious. The lord who owned the mill was often expected to cover the cost of major structural repairs, while the miller was responsible for routine maintenance and smaller fixes. But the line between a major repair and a routine one was not always obvious, and what looked to the miller like a structural failure requiring the lord's investment could look to the lord like negligence on the part of the man he was paying to keep the machinery running. These disagreements surfaced in manor court proceedings and in written disputes that occasionally made their way into estate records, leaving behind a picture of a relationship that was functional but not without friction. Tenants who were obligated to use the lord's mill had their own grievances. If the mill was broken and grinding had stopped, they might petition for permission to take their grain elsewhere temporarily, and whether that permission was granted depended on the inclinations of the lord and the terms of the local custom. If the wait was long, if the miller was difficult, if the toll seemed higher than it should have been, these complaints circulated through the village and occasionally found formal expression in the manor court as well. The miller stood in the middle of all this, accountable in both directions, answerable to the lord who owned the mill and to the community that used it. What this meant in practical terms was that the miller occupied a peculiar position of dependency. He depended on the lord for the physical infrastructure of his livelihood, the building, the machinery, the mill pond, the legal framework that sent customers to his door. But the lord depended on him too, to maintain the equipment, to manage the daily traffic of grain and flour, and to generate the income that made the mill worth owning in the first place. This mutual dependency did not make them equals, but it gave the miller a degree of practical leverage that a simple labourer did not have. A miller who understood the machinery thoroughly, who kept the stones running smoothly and the customers satisfied, was not easily replaced, and a lord who pushed too hard on the rents risked losing a capable man to another manor. These arrangements, for all their local variation, gave the miller's life a texture of obligation and negotiation that ran through every working day. The grain on the stones and the flour in the sack were part of a larger structure of ownership and custom and law that the miller navigated as naturally as he navigated the turns of the millstones. He knew who held the legal rights, he knew what he owed and when. And he knew that the turning of the mill served not just the village that brought its grain, but the estate that owned the ground beneath his feet and the walls around his work. The mill did not turn the same way in every season. The stones might spin at roughly the same speed whether it was midsummer or midwinter, but the life built around them shifted constantly, shaped by the rhythms of the agricultural year and the moods of weather and water and wind. To understand what the miller's days actually felt like across the full turning of a year is to understand that his work was not a steady repetition of the same tasks, but something more like a long breath in and out, with periods of near exhaustion and periods of something close to quiet. Spring was a time of watching and waiting. The fields had been planted or were being prepared, and the grain from the previous harvest had mostly been processed through the winter months. The miller might find himself with lighter traffic at the mill, fewer carts pulling up to the door, fewer farmers standing in line with sacks of rye or barley or wheat on their shoulders. This was not idleness. A man who ran a mill understood that the quieter months were the months when the work behind the work needed to happen. The millstones, which had been grinding steadily since the autumn, accumulated wear that had to be addressed before the next great surge of business arrived. The surface of each stone, cut with a careful pattern of grooves called the furrow and the land, gradually dulled and flattened as grain passed across it, and a stone that had lost its edge did not grind efficiently. Dressing the stones, the skilled and time-consuming work of recutting those surfaces with a metal pick called a bill, was best done when demand was light. Spring also brought structural inspections. The mill pond, if the mill was a watermill, had endured the weight of winter rains and the turbulence of snowmelt, and the dam and sluice required careful examination. Timber that had softened through repeated freezing and thawing needed replacement. The wooden gearing inside the mill, the great wheel, the pit wheel, the wallower, the wooden cogs slotted into each of them, had been under stress for months and might show cracking or loosening that, left unaddressed, would cause a much larger failure at exactly the wrong moment. The miller walked through his equipment the way a sailor walked the rigging of his ship before a long voyage, knowing that what he found now was far better to find than what might break later, in the middle of a grinding day, with a queue of farmers outside and a lord who expected the rent on time regardless. Summer settled into a different kind of pace. The crops were growing in the fields, and the miller knew that the pace of his season would be determined by what those crops did between now and the harvest. He worked steadily through the summer months, processing the last of the stored grain from households managing their own reserves, but his busiest days were still ahead of him. If the season was wet enough to keep the mill pond full, or if the wind cooperated with the sails of a windmill, summer could be a reasonable stretch of manageable work. If it was too dry, though, and the stream feeding the mill pond dropped to a trickle, the watermill slowed, and then stopped. Summer droughts could be more disruptive than winter storms in some ways, because they came precisely when the miller expected to be building toward his busiest period. He might watch the mill pond recede inch by inch through a dry July, making calculations about how much water he could afford to use and how long he could keep the stones turning before the pond could no longer drive the wheel. Then came the harvest, and everything changed. When the grain came in from the fields, it came in quantities that flooded the mill with more work than any other period of the year could produce. The weeks immediately following harvest, from late summer stretching into autumn, were the intense heart of the miller's year. Farmers arrived from across the village and the surrounding countryside, some with small amounts and some with substantial loads, all of them needing their grain reduced to flour before the winter set in. The queue at the mill grew long, the stones turned long into the evening, and the miller worked hours that would have exhausted him at any other time of year, sustained partly by the knowledge that this was the season that determined how comfortable his own household would be through the colder months ahead. Autumn brought a particular urgency to everything. There was a palpable sense in a medieval agricultural community of racing the weather, of needing to complete the processing of grain before the first hard frosts made roads impassable, before rains turned mill lanes into mud, before the days shortened so severely that working by the light of a tallow candle became the only option for the hours after dusk. The miller pushed through this period like a man swimming against a current that was also carrying him where he needed to go. It was exhausting and in its way deeply satisfying, the kind of work that filled a day so completely that the evening arrived as a real relief. Winter narrowed things down again. After the harvest rush had subsided, the mill still turned, but at a more deliberate pace. Households continued to bring grain as they needed flour through the winter months, drawing down their stored supplies incrementally rather than processing everything at once. The miller had time to breathe, to make the repairs that had been deferred during the busy autumn weeks, to sit with his family in the evenings without the weight of an overwhelming queue waiting for him in the morning. Winter was also the season when weather made its most dramatic interventions. A hard freeze could lock a mill pond solid and stop the wheel entirely for days or weeks. A windmill's sails, iced over, became dangerous. A flood, and the swollen rivers and streams of winter brought real flooding to low-lying mills, could submerge the mill wheel, break the dam, and fill the mill interior with water and mud that required days of labour to clear afterward. Storms tore the thatch from mill roofs and brought tree limbs down across mill races. These events were not catastrophes in the way we might imagine them today. They were part of the texture of the miller's year, anticipated in a general sense even if their specific timing was not. The miller who had been doing this work for a decade knew which months were likely to bring flood risk, and which were likely to bring drought. He had seen ice on the mill pond before, and he knew roughly how long it would take to thaw. He had a sense, built from experience, of how much disruption each kind of event was likely to cause, and how much effort recovery would require. What the year in motion ultimately reveals is that the miller's life was inseparable from the life of the land around him. His busiest days and his quietest days were not determined by personal choice or business decisions in any modern sense. They were determined by the wheat and the rye, and the barley growing in fields he did not own, by the rain falling on a watershed he could not control, by the frost settling on a mill pond on a December morning, and the slow thaw that would follow. He was woven into the agricultural calendar of his community as completely as the ploughman or the reaper, only with the added responsibility of machinery that needed constant attention through every season the year chose to bring. There were years that went as expected, and there were years that did not. The miller who had spent a lifetime beside his turning wheel understood, in a way that was almost bodily, that the rhythms described by any ordinary year were really just the rhythm of a year that had been reasonably kind, a wet spring that rotted seed in the ground before it could germinate, a summer that turned so dry the grain stalks never filled properly, a sudden autumn hail that flattened a field of wheat just before harvest. Any one of these could transform the familiar turning of the agricultural calendar into something slower and more anxious, a season that moved at the pace of worry rather than the pace of work. When the harvest was thin, the miller felt it almost immediately. The queue that normally stretched from the mill door out into the lane in the weeks after harvest was shorter than usual. The sacks that arrived were lighter. Farmers who in a good year might bring enough grain to keep the stones turning steadily for an afternoon arrived instead with smaller amounts, spreading their processing across more visits, making what they had last as long as possible. The miller noticed the difference not just in his workload, but in the faces of the people who came to him. There was a quietness to a poor harvest year that was different from the ordinary quietness of a slow winter week. It was a watching kind of quiet, a cautiousness in how people moved and spoke and measured. For the miller himself, less grain to grind meant less income. The toll grain he collected as payment, that portion of each customer's flour that went into his own bins as the price of the service, was smaller when the loads brought to him were smaller. His household stores, which he had grown accustomed to building up through the busy autumn weeks, grew more slowly or not at all. He faced the approaching winter with thinner reserves than he would have chosen, knowing that if the next spring also proved difficult, the margin between adequate and not adequate would narrow further. Disease could arrive without warning and change the shape of a year in ways that had nothing to do with weather or crop failure. The death of a plough ox, or the sickness moving through a village that kept farmers at home and away from the mill, or the illness of the miller himself or someone in his household, any of these disrupted the ordinary flow of life in ways that were quiet but genuinely hard. A miller who fell seriously ill during the harvest season faced a particular kind of trouble, because the work that most needed doing was piling up outside his door while his body refused to cooperate with the schedule the season demanded. His family might manage the simpler tasks, receiving grain, managing the toll, keeping the stones running at a basic level, but the skilled work of adjusting the grinding, interpreting the flour, maintaining the equipment safely, belonged to him in ways that could not simply be delegated. War, when it came, was a different kind of disruption again. Open conflict in the countryside, or the movement of armies that commandeered grain and disrupted the ordinary paths of trade and agricultural life, could empty a mill of customers and then of purpose for stretches that felt endless. A miller whose customers could not safely travel to the mill, or whose grain had been requisitioned before it could be processed, found himself standing beside silent stones in a way that had nothing meditative about it. The wheel might still turn in the mill race, driven by the same water it had always used, but the turning was purposeless in a way that unsettled a man who had organized his entire life around making it useful. And yet, the thing about these harder stretches, the thing that is easy to lose sight of from the distance of centuries, is that they were lived through rather than simply suffered. The miller did not experience a poor harvest as a catastrophe in the way we might imagine a sudden disaster arriving from outside. It came gradually, announced itself in stages, and allowed a gradual adaptation alongside the anxiety it produced. He tightened what could be tightened. He traded what could be traded. He drew on the relationships he'd built over years with the people around him, because a community living through a thin harvest year was not a community of individuals each struggling alone. It was a network of mutual knowledge and quiet accommodation, of debts informally deferred, and small exchanges that didn't need to be named in order to be understood. The mill itself, even in difficult stretches, remained a place of warmth. The friction of the grinding stones generated heat, and in the colder months the mill interior held a gentle warmth that was different from the warmth of a fire, steadier, more ambient, rising up through the wooden floor from the machinery below. A man who had been outside in the raw cold of a November morning felt the mill's particular atmosphere as a kind of welcome when he came back inside. The smell of fresh flour, which was always present in a working mill, had the quality of something deeply familiar, not remarkable on any individual day, but so consistently there that it became one of the background notes of his entire life. Routine itself was a comfort in uncertain times. The morning inspection of the stones, the adjustment of the sluice, the receiving of the first customers of the day. These tasks continued even when the volume of work was reduced, and their continuation was a form of steadiness in seasons that felt unsteady. There is something to be said for the comfort of knowing what your hands are supposed to do next, even when the larger circumstances of your life are less clear. The fellowship of the mill, the conversations that happened while grain was being weighed, the news exchanged between customers waiting their turn, the occasional evening visit from a neighbour who had nothing particular to discuss, but whose presence in the doorway was companionable all the same, did not disappear during hard years. If anything, the difficulty of those years drew people into closer conversation about shared concerns. The miller, standing at the centre of a community's grain supply, was one of the people to whom others naturally turned when they wanted to know how their neighbours were faring. He knew, better than almost anyone, how much grain was moving through the village and at what pace, which households were managing adequately and which were running thin. This knowledge carried its own kind of weight, but it also connected him to the life around him in ways that made even the difficult seasons feel inhabited, rather than merely endured. By the time the hard year began to turn, when a better spring arrived, and the grain in the field showed signs of recovering, when the illness passed, and the road became safe again, the miller found himself returning to the familiar rhythms with something like gratitude. Not the dramatic gratitude of a man who had narrowly escaped disaster, but the quieter gratitude of someone who had come through a difficult stretch and was glad to be on the other side of it. The stones turned. The flour ran into the bin. Someone arrived at the door with a sack on their shoulder, and the ordinary life of the mill gathered itself back around him like familiar clothing, worn enough to be comfortable, sturdy enough to last. There is a version of the medieval miller that has travelled through centuries largely unchallenged, a rough figure in a dusty apron, operating a simple device, taking more than his fair share and getting away with it because no one was watching closely enough to stop him. That portrait is not entirely without foundation, but it leaves out a great deal, and what it leaves out is often more interesting than what it includes. Begin with the technology itself, because the assumption that medieval milling was primitive by any meaningful measure is one that collapses quickly under examination. By the later medieval centuries, millwrights in some regions of Europe had developed a sophisticated understanding of gear ratios, water flow mechanics, and stone dynamics that allowed them to build mills capable of producing remarkably consistent flour at volumes that would have seemed improbable to earlier generations. The great commercial mills of northern France, the Low Countries, and parts of England were not simple machines. They incorporated carefully calibrated wooden gearing systems, adjustable millstone mechanisms that could be raised or lowered with precision, and sluice arrangements complex enough to manage variable water levels across different seasons. The men who designed and maintained these machines carried knowledge that was genuinely technical, passed down through apprenticeship and refined across generations, and it bore more resemblance to early engineering than to the rough improvisation the word medieval sometimes implies. The village miller working a modest watermill was not operating at the same level of mechanical sophistication as those larger commercial installations, but even his equipment was more nuanced than it might appear. The relationship between the gap set between the grinding faces of the millstones and the quality of flour produced was not something he guessed at. He understood it through long experience and careful attention, A gap too wide produced coarse, uneven flour, while a gap too tight produced flour that was hot from friction and degraded in ways that any experienced baker would detect immediately. Managing that gap across a working day, as the stones wore incrementally and the types of grain being processed changed, was a continuous act of skilled adjustment. The miller did this largely by touch and sound, reading the machine the way a musician reads an instrument, making corrections so habitual that they barely registered as conscious decisions. One of the more overlooked dimensions of the trade is the extent to which successful milling, even at the village level, involved what we might recognize as record-keeping and customer management. In settings where the miller operated under a Lord's Mill monopoly and was accountable to an estate for the tolls he collected, he was often expected to maintain some account of the grain processed and the dues taken. This might be done through notched tally sticks rather than written ledgers, but the underlying principle was the same. There was a numerical record of exchange that could be checked against expected yields. A miller who could not account for discrepancies between the grain received and the flour returned was a miller whose position became difficult to defend. The administrative dimension of the work, knowing whose grain was whose, tracking what had been processed and what was still waiting, ensuring that the toll taken was defensible if questioned, was real and ongoing, even if it rarely appears in the romantic image of the man beside his wheel. The differences between millers working in different settings were substantial enough that it is almost misleading to describe them under a single occupation. The miller of a small village serving a community of perhaps a few dozen farming households led a life that was intimate, socially embedded, and largely predictable in its rhythms. He knew every customer by name, knew their land and their usual yields, and operated within a web of personal relationships that shaped every transaction. The urban miller working a mill on the edge of a town or city and processing grain for a more anonymous and varied clientele that might include bakers, brewers, and middlemen as well as ordinary households, operated in a commercial environment that was more transactional, faster-paced, and less governed by the long-standing personal familiarity of village life. He might process considerably greater volumes of grain in a day, but have far less knowledge of where that grain had come from or who would ultimately consume it. In the largest commercial milling operations, the great monastic mills, the multi-wheel installations on major rivers, the urban mills that supplied entire city quarters, the miller himself might be more of a manager than a hands-on operator, overseeing workers who ran the stones while he coordinated the flow of incoming grain and outgoing flour. The social position of such a man was meaningfully different from that of the village miller. He was closer to a businessman than to a craftsman, navigating relationships with suppliers, institutional buyers, and the owners or lords whose investment he was managing. This version of the medieval miller almost never appears in popular imagination, but he existed, and in some periods and regions he represented a significant economic actor in the grain trade. There is also the matter of what millers actually did with their expertise beyond the mill itself. Because grain processing was central to every other form of food production, bread, ale, pottage thickened with meal, the miller's knowledge was sought in contexts that extended well beyond his own millstones. A miller who understood grain quality, who could assess whether a batch of wheat had been stored well or had begun to degrade, was a useful person to consult before a purchase was made. In some communities, his judgment about grain condition was treated as something close to authoritative, not formally, not by any written rule, but by the accumulated trust that came from years of demonstrable competence. One detail that tends to surprise people is the degree to which the timing of milling could be a genuine source of social negotiation. In a busy season, access to the mill was not simply first come first served in every case. Certain customers, those with larger holdings, those whose relationship with the landlord who owned the mill gave them precedence. Those whose grain was particularly time-sensitive because they were supplying a baker with a pressing order might expect to have their grain processed before others who had arrived earlier. Managing that queue without producing lasting resentment in the customers who waited longer was a social skill that mattered as much as any mechanical one. The miller who handled these situations clumsily made enemies. The one who handled them well maintained the kind of functional harmony that made every working day easier than it might otherwise have been. And then there is this. Flour dust, the fine suspended particles that filled the air of any actively working mill, was genuinely dangerous in concentrations high enough to ignite. Medieval millers were not in a position to name the chemistry involved, but they knew through hard experience that certain conditions inside a mill, dry air, fine dust, an open flame brought too close, could lead to catastrophic fires. The caution with which fire was treated inside a working mill was not superstition. It was hard-won practical knowledge, earned in some cases at serious cost. That a man spent his working life managing an invisible explosive, largely without thinking about it as such, is perhaps the most quietly remarkable fact about the whole occupation. The kind of detail that, once you know it, makes the ordinary morning at the mill feel rather different than it did before. The day at the mill does not end all at once. It slows gradually, the way light fades in autumn, imperceptibly at first, and then with a kind of gentle inevitability that makes the quieting feel earned. The last customer of the afternoon has collected his sack, thrown it over his shoulder, and made his way back along the path toward the village. The wheel still turns, catching the water with its familiar rhythm, but there is less urgency in the sound now. The miller adjusts the sluice, easing the flow, and the great stones slow their rotation until they stop with a low, settling heaviness that seems to exhale into the air around them. The dust that has hung all day in thin clouds begins to drift downward, coating the window sill, the sill of the door, the surfaces of everything inside the mill in a fine, pale layer. The miller sweeps what he can, checks the stones, runs a hand along the wooden teeth of the gear to feel for any unusual wear. These last tasks are unhurried, almost meditative. They are the things a man does not because they are urgent, but because the doing of them is part of what it means to know his trade completely. To close the day the same way he would want to open the next one, with everything in its proper order. Outside, the river or the mill pond continues its quiet work regardless, moving on toward whatever lies downstream. The miller steps to the doorway and stands for a moment in the cooling air. If the season is summer, the evening light is long and gold, falling across the meadow grass, catching the water in small bright flashes. If it is winter, the light is already gone, and what remains is a deep blue stillness and the smell of cold coming off the water. He has stood here many hundreds of evenings. He will stand here many hundreds more if the years are kind to him. This is the rhythm that shaped a medieval life. Not dramatic, not extraordinary, but continuous and purposeful in a way that ran beneath everything. The miller occupied a position that was neither grand nor insignificant. He was necessary. The village required him the way it required the seasons, dependably, without ceremony, without pause. Lords required him too, and watched him carefully, and collected their rents from what his labour produced. But between the legal obligations and the social suspicions, there was a man who knew his river, knew his stones, knew the particular way his own mill sounded when everything was running well, and knew immediately when something was not quite right. That knowledge accumulated over years, passed from hand to hand through generations, was a form of quiet mastery that deserved far more recognition than it typically received. His family has eaten this evening from what his work provides. Bread made from flour ground in this very room, perhaps a stew thickened with meal, something stored or preserved from a more generous season. The house beside the mill is warm in the way that small, low-ceilinged spaces become warm when a fire has burned in them through the day. His wife has tended it. His children have moved through it, loud and particular, and entirely themselves. The sounds of the household have been the other music of the day, running alongside the sound of the wheel the way a second melody runs beneath the first. Soon the fire will be banked, the children will be asleep, and the miller himself will lie down in the dark and listen, almost without meaning to, for the sounds of the mill. The water moves, the timbers of the building settle. Somewhere the wheel turns slightly in the current, finding its resting position. These sounds are indistinguishable from silence to anyone who did not grow up beside them. To the miller, they are the sound of everything being as it should be. There is a kind of life that does not announce itself with heroism or drama. That is built instead from the slow accumulation of early mornings, difficult seasons, small satisfactions, and the deep quiet of an ordinary evening. The medieval miller lived that kind of life, and in living it, he kept something essential turning at the heart of the world that depended on him. Let that thought settle with you as the evening settles outside, and let the quiet that follows be its own kind of rest. If this journey through the miller's world was something you found yourself wanting to return to, please consider leaving a like. It helps more than you might think, and it tells us that these long, slow explorations of forgotten lives are worth continuing. Leave a comment if a particular moment stayed with you, or if there is another corner of history you would like to wander through next, and if you would like to find yourself here again on another quiet night, subscribe to History Drift and we will be here, waiting whenever you are ready to listen.